This week, as this podcast is released, U.S. officials are gathering to discuss whether or not to sign memoranda of understanding with Yemen and Morocco that would effectively say communal Jewish property belongs to these countries and not to the Jews that were driven out of there. Let's dive in. I'm Lev Gringaus, and welcome to The Jews Are Tired, your podcast about Jewish news. So, there are a lot of layers to understand about the U.S. Memoranda of Understanding with Yemen and Morocco currently being debated, but let's start with the basics. First, the legal side. Under the Convention of Cultural Property Implementation Act of 1983, the U.S. government has the power to stop any import of archaeological or cultural property from a country that asks the U.S. to do so. The reason for this is to try and cut down on the market for stealing and selling historical artifacts, which becomes a very real issue, particularly in times of instability. Take Yemen, for example. Yemen has been locked in a brutal civil war for the past few years, and that instability makes it very easy for people to take and sell historical artifacts that might otherwise be protected. So to help keep stuff from leaving the country, Yemen comes to the US and says, hey, can you make sure you don't have anything that's ours? And the US says, sure. And they sign this memorandum of understanding that the U.S. won't import any of Yemen's stuff without Yemen's permission, basically, and that if the U.S. does have Yemen's stuff, they'll send it back. But opposite the legal side of things is the Jewish side of things, where it all gets complicated, because hundreds of thousands of Mizrahi and Sephardi Jews used to live across North Africa and the Middle East, in countries like Yemen, Morocco, Syria, Iraq, and others. And like much of Jewish life, these communities alternated between relative peace and prosperity and oppression and murder. Particularly in the decades after 1948, as Arab nationalism gained a foothold across the Middle East and countries exercised their hatred of the newly formed Jewish state of Israel on their citizens, Jews were stripped of property, forced out of work, killed for being Zionists, and eventually over 850,000 Jews ended up fleeing for their lives. This means that today there are almost or actually no Jews left in places like Syria, Yemen, or Iraq, where Jewish communities had histories dating back over 2,000 years. What this also means is that Chanukiahs, books, Torah scrolls, many of these essential belongings and records of any Jewish community were left behind in these hostile countries. So to put two and two together, it's these Jewish historical artifacts that are oftentimes claimed by countries, the same countries that drove Jews out, as their own when coming to the U.S. for memoranda of understanding. So naturally, there's a good deal of lobbying by Jews to not have the U.S. sign these MOUs, with the argument being that the Jewish communal property belongs to the Jews and not to these countries. But lobbying doesn't always work. MOUs have already been signed with countries like Syria, where civil war has ravaged the place since 2011, and Iraq, itself hugely unstable after U.S. invasions and the rise of terrorist groups like ISIS. And there are a ton of conflicting issues. The Western world, over the past 200 years, has looted a ton of archaeology from all parts of the world and just held onto it without accountability. And politicians in countries like Morocco and Iraq have said that Jewish history is essential to their countries, and they need to hold on to that history and artifacts to support pluralism and tolerance. So that sensitivity colors these MOUs as well about the right of countries to claim their history. But still, should the U.S. allow these countries to claim Jewish property as their own through broad MOUs? Does a community that lives abroad have legal rights to the property they left behind, even under duress? And is it right to keep historical artifacts in war zones like Syria and Yemen, or unstable regions like Iraq where they might just be looted or damaged there? So there are a lot of tangled questions. It should be noted that, for now, there is really only one real-world example of Jewish property being held in this tug-of-war, which is the case of the Iraqi Jewish archives. I highly recommend checking out the Forward's reporting on the story of the archives, which were found during the U.S. invasion in Iraq in 2003 and airlifted to the U.S. to be restored, and which are still here while Iraq tries to get the archives back. But still, the MOUs mean something in a legal sense, which, as critics say, is effectively the US telling other countries, yeah, you get to call Jewish stuff your stuff, even if they drove most of their Jews out. So, what will happen to the MOUs with Yemen and Morocco being debated today and tomorrow by the State Department's Cultural Advisory Committee? I just don't know. But it's important to remember the global scope of Jewish cultural heritage and the struggle to hold on to that. I'll try and bring you an update on this story when I have it. If you'd like to know more about this story, check out Jimena, that's Jimena, an organization representing Jews from the Middle East and North Africa, which is one of the main groups lobbying against these MOUs. Take a look at the podcast notes for a link to their website and the forward reporting I mentioned earlier. Now, to our next, and due to density, last story for this podcast. Last week, the American Jewish Committee, a global Jewish advocacy organization, released a survey on how American Jews view anti-Semitism in the United States right now. And I want to do something different with the data than what you might have seen, which is to add an extra bit of context by way of a similar study commissioned by the European Union in 2018 across 12 EU member countries. So, for example, one of the main bits of data from the AJC study, when asked how much of a problem anti-Semitism is in the United States today, 38% of American Jews said a very serious problem, and 50% said somewhat of a problem. For anyone quick with the math, that's a combined 88%. Now, when European Jews were asked the same question in 2018, the average of the 12 countries surveyed had 45% saying that anti-Semitism is a very big problem, and 40% saying it's a fairly big problem. So slightly different wordings, and it should be noted that this is an average of 12 countries that had varying individual answers, but on the whole, that makes 85% of European Jews who say anti-Semitism is a serious issue. So American Jews say 88%, European Jews say 85%. I think you understand where I'm going with this, but let's look at two other data points. On whether anti-Semitism has increased over the past 5 years, 84% of American Jews said it increased a lot or a little. On average, 89% of European Jews said it increased a lot or a little. When answering a question about avoiding wearing or carrying things that would identify someone as a Jew, 31% of American Jews said yes, they had hidden their identity like this, and on average, 6% of European Jews said they always hid their identity publicly, 22% said they frequently do so, and 43% said they occasionally do so. The AJC survey only had a yes or no response to this question, but it's intriguing to think how American Jews might have answered if given the European options. What I'm trying to get at by putting these surveys side by side is that often different surveys about anti-Semitism or Jewish views of anti-Semitism just get put out. And almost always, there are real issues pointed to in those surveys, but I don't think we should be looking at them in a vacuum. Yes, America and Europe are very different in many ways, but I think when it comes to anti-Semitism, maybe it's not as different as we'd like to think. And I lay this point out tentatively, because there's this underlying, reaction that American Jews have when thinking about European anti-Semitism. For most of us, our families left there to find something better in the United States, and we like to think that what goes on there can't possibly be what goes on here. And I'm not trying to say this as a, hey, let's all be scared and go for the comparisons to 1933 Germany. I'm saying this because as a Russian-speaking Jew, there's a reason that I've heard the sentiment from a lot of immigrants that we left Europe to get away from anti-Semitism and it followed us to America. So maybe I'm crazy, maybe it's just me, but I see recognizing today's trends in anti-Semitism on this global level just as a reality check. And in fact, you see a lot of similar trends when looking at surveys about other things involving Jews, like how little people in the United States or Canada or Europe know about the Holocaust, or even good things involving Jews, like surveys about Jewish identity looking very similar for American and European Jews. But whether this reality check should make us more concerned or less concerned than the basic fact of seeing the rise in anti-Semitism right now, to be honest, that I just don't know. Anyway, I'll step off my soapbox for one last moment, just to cover a few other thought-provoking bits from the AJC study. On a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being not at all responsible for anti-Semitism, and 10 being totally responsible, 75%, or 3/4 of American Jews, rated the Democratic Party between 1 to 5, with 30% of them rating Democrats at a 1, or bearing zero responsibility for anti-Semitism. To the same scale, but asked about the Republican Party, 61% of American Jews rated Republicans from 6 to 10 as being responsible for current levels of anti-Semitism in America, with 42% of them rating from 8 to 10, meaning that Republicans have a near total responsibility for anti-Semitism in their view. And nearly 3/4 of American Jews said that President Trump is not doing a good job of dealing with anti-Semitism. So it seems pretty interesting, though not necessarily surprising, that most American Jews are not fans of Trump or Republicans right now. I'll leave you to chew on that, but if you want to check out the AJC survey results for yourself, check out the podcast notes for the link. This has been this week's The Jews Are Tired podcast. I'm Lev Gringauz. Don't forget to subscribe and share, and hopefully next week, the Jews will get some rest. The Jews Are Tired is a product of Jewfolk Inc. For more information, go to tcjewfolk.com or email the show at podcast@tcjewfolk.com.